West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Chef Justice Putnam. netrootsradio.com.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ma fleur, sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, qu'il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte.
Well, it was in a classroom at a Catholic high school in Boston where I first heard the phrase, crisis of faith. It was during religion class that a priest told us about a crisis of faith that he had some years earlier. For priests, a crisis of faith is losing the belief in God. It is so common for priests to have a crisis of faith that they have a term for it, and they have a process to deal with it. Priests leave their priestly duties temporarily until the crisis of faith passes, or permanently if it doesn't. I have been experiencing a crisis of faith for the last year or so and have not known quite what to say about it or who to talk to about it. There are priests who specialize in counseling Catholic priests who are experiencing a crisis of faith, but I'm not sure who to turn to for my crisis of faith. It is a crisis of faith in what has been a God-like presence in my life. When I was baptized into the Catholic faith at birth, my father was a Boston police officer. By the time I was in high school, learning about a Catholic priest having a crisis of faith, my father was a lawyer who had already argued and won a case in the United States Supreme Court. I was there in the Supreme Court that day when my father made his case to the justices. I was 11 years old. I had been in many churches and cathedrals by the time I was 11 and had seen monsignors and cardinals on the altar, but had never experienced more majesty in a room than sitting there looking up at the Warren Court. There was the Republican-appointed Chief Justice Earl Warren, flanked by legends on both sides of him, including the most liberal member of the court, William O. Douglas, appointed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This was the court that ordered the desegregation of public schools in America in 1954. This was the court that found state laws banning interracial marriage to be unconstitutional. Earl Warren had been the Chief Justice of the United States every day of my life. Thurgood Marshall would join the Warren Court in its last years and personally represent, as the first African-American member of the Supreme Court, the steady march of social progress that the Warren Court guided this country through using, we then thought, something as sacred as the Ten Commandments, the Constitution of the United States. We did not think that Chief Justice Earl Warren and Justice Douglas and Justice Brennan and Justice Marshall and other legends of the Warren Court were delivering this progress. We thought the Constitution was delivering that process. We thought that the Warren Court was employing the most refined level of legal scholarship possible to reach its constitutional pronouncements, and no other result was possible. My father lived in awe of the Supreme Court, and so did his children. It was a religious-like awe. We never talked about who appointed the justices after they were appointed because it didn't seem particularly relevant. We thought Richard Nixon was a truly terrible, indeed criminal president, but his appointments to the Supreme Court were not bad. The court survived the Nixon years without any questions about its legitimacy. The court, led by a Chief Justice appointed by Richard Nixon, in a unanimous opinion, ordered Richard Nixon to hand over audio tapes that destroyed the Nixon presidency and forced Richard Nixon to resign the presidency. In 1973, a Republican-dominated Supreme Court delivered the opinion in Roe versus Wade that allowed every pregnant woman in America to decide whether to carry that pregnancy. And so my faith in the Supreme Court remained strong no matter who was president. Then came Senator Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump, who delegitimized the Supreme Court in a way that had been unthinkable until 2016, when Mitch McConnell refused to allow even a confirmation hearing for President Obama's last appointee to the Supreme Court, Merrick Garland. By forcing that Supreme Court seat to remain open for a year, Donald Trump was able to name Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. And so whenever you see the name Gorsuch on a Supreme Court opinion, you should be seeing the name Garland. The word Gorsuch is an illegitimate presence in the Supreme Court opinions and takes its place in those opinions only through the corruption of the Supreme Court confirmation process wrought by Republican Senator Mitch McConnell and completed by the most corrupt president in history, Donald Trump. Neil Gorsuch does not evidence a whiff of embarrassment about his illegitimate placement on the Supreme Court, the, pardon the expression, affirmative action it took by Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump to get him on the Supreme Court. This last year is the year in which the United States Supreme Court has entered the most publicly corrupt phase of its entire history. It is entirely possible that 200 years ago, there were forms of corruption involving Supreme Court justices that never became public and historians never found. That's possible. But based exclusively on the public record, it is undeniable that the current court, this Republican-dominated Roberts Court, is the most corrupt in history. And they are corrupt on two fronts. One, extreme financial improprieties and obvious financial conflicts of interest with billionaire litigants whose cases appear before the Supreme Court, but the much graver corruption in the Supreme Court, the corruption that affects the daily lives of all of us, is the corruption of Supreme Court scholarship. Is legal scholarship scholarship if you can just make up stuff? That is the question that I have been privately asking myself for over a year now, and that is the essence of my crisis of faith, where I once faithfully believed that the Warren Court, followed by the Berger Court, were using the most refined techniques of legal scholarship to deliver to us the true meaning of the Constitution. I now believe the Republican justices on the Supreme Court are just making it up. And they are doing that in a way that scholars cannot possibly do in other areas of scholarship like mathematics or chemistry or biology. And so we have a Supreme Court whose final decision of the year was based on a person who was made up, a person who does not exist. The Republicans on the Supreme Court decided, as Justice Sonia Sotomayor says in her dissent, that, quote, a particular kind of business, though open to the public, has a constitutional right to refuse to serve members of a protected class. The court does so for the first time in its history by issuing this new license to discriminate in a case brought by a company that seeks to deny same-sex couples the full and equal enjoyment of its services. The immediate symbolic effect of the decision is to mark gays and lesbians for second-class status. In this way, the decision itself inflicts a kind of stigmatic harm on top of any harm caused by denials of service. The opinion of the court is quite finally a notice that reads, "Some services may be denied to same-sex couples." It was just the day before the Supreme Court issued that opinion, thanks to Melissa Grant reporting in the New Republic, that the same-sex couple named in the lawsuit that reached the United States Supreme Court was proven not to exist. That same-sex couple did not even exist. The lawsuit falsely claimed that a same-sex couple named Stuart and Mike wanted to have a website made for their upcoming wedding. The lawsuit included a phone number for the couple, which Melissa Grant called to discover that Stuart has been married to a woman for many years and has a daughter, and had no idea that his first name and phone number appeared in a case before the United States Supreme Court and was used to deny other people their rights. But because the opinion had already been sent to the printer, there was nothing that the Roberts Court was going to do about the fraud perpetrated on the Supreme Court. And if the court is just making stuff up, they obviously don't care about details like the people who are activating the case in front of them actually existing. That same Supreme Court ruled against what it incorrectly believes is Harvard College's admissions policy. Republicans on the Supreme Court showed an unrelenting ignorance about the 387-year history of Harvard admissions policy by insisting that Harvard must stop the practice of admitting any student solely because of the color of the student's skin. Harvard has never admitted anyone solely for that reason. And so the Republican-controlled Supreme Court was making a ruling based on a myth that will have next to no effect on Harvard's actual admissions policy. Many wise observers of the court have been publicly sharing in my crisis of faith without using that phrase. Norm Ornstein was, for most of the decades of his exemplary professional work in Washington as a congressional scholar, known and trusted for a complete absence of partisanship in his scholarship. The Trump years have left Norm Ornstein standing very clearly on one side of our partisan divide, but still, as always, speaking the truth about Washington institutions, including the Supreme Court. Norm Ornstein says, quote, "It is not just the rulings the Roberts Court is making. They created out of whole cloth a bogus major questions doctrine. They made a mockery of standing. They rewrite laws to fit their radical ideological preferences. They have unilaterally blown up the legitimacy of the court." When the Roberts Court ruled last week on President Biden's student debt relief plan, Chief Justice John Roberts leaned on something he called the major questions doctrine, which, as Supreme Court reporter Dahlia Lithwick points out, is not really a doctrine at all. That opinion, written by Chief Justice Roberts, provoked a dissent by Justice Elena Kagan, which seems to reveal a crisis of faith much more severe than mine. An actual member of the Supreme Court now seems to have lost faith in the Supreme Court. In her dissent to the Chief Justice's opinion on student loan relief, Justice Kagan wrote, "From the first page to the last, today's opinion departs from the demands of judicial restraint At the behest of a party that has suffered no injury, the majority decides a contested public policy issue properly belonging to the politically accountable branches and the people they represent. That is a major problem, not just for governance, but for democracy too. Congress is, of course, a democratic institution. It responds, even if imperfectly, to the preferences of American voters. And agency officials, though not themselves elected, serve a president with the broadest of all political constituencies. But this court, it is, by design, as detached as possible from the body politic. That is why the court is supposed to stick to its business, to decide only cases and controversies, and to stay away from making this nation's policy about subjects like student loan relief. And that means the court, by deciding this case, exercises authority it does not have. It violates the Constitution. Justice Kagan is 63 years old. She will, if the country is lucky, serve another 10 to 20 years on the Supreme Court. She will do so knowing she is not serving on the Supreme Court she grew up admiring, on the Supreme Court she no doubt dreamed of serving on when she was a law student. She is serving on a Supreme Court that she believes violates the Constitution. That is as grave a crisis of faith as has ever been publicly voiced by a Supreme Court justice.
It is Thursday, the 6th of July of 2023, and you are in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. I am your chef de cuisine, Justice Putnam. Gunner the English Bulldog is our snoozing sous chef. Precious, the little Yorkie, is our door girl, and she will be seating you directly for our especially special daily special, Metro Shrimp and Grits Thursdays. A little bit of jambalaya, a little bit of spice in your life, and we just bring a little. All right. Sometimes too much might be too much. Some people can take too much, and a lot won't be able to because it's too much. All right. You run into these metaphysical conundrums when you've only had, 2/3 of your coffee and not the full amount. Whatever that amount is, we've only had 2/3. It's not enough. Okay, that's another metaphysical conundrum that one is presented with. When the coffee pot is out in another part of, the abode, more than a few steps away, but too many steps away to break away and get it, because we are here now, and we're not moving. How are you otherwise? I hope you've had all of your sustenance and, whatever gets your charge going. Yep. I like to justify, my coffee. I like to use that sometimes as a verb too, but anyway, by making it into a ritual. That's right. Therefore, it's not something else that starts with A. Okay. Not addicted. Caffeine is a nutrient that our body lacks, and we have a minimum daily requirement. Okay. Whereas one might get into trouble is when you rot your gut away. We don't want that. All right. Anyway, sometimes it's fun to say that I haven't had enough coffee for the excuse on why I'm confused. Am I? No, not confused. But I tend to go off on tangents, can you tell? Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think maybe I'm on a jag is because I had to reassure my mom this morning that things are okay. She's kind of takes some of her decline, people get pissed, when you recognize that. And at other times she's kind of jovial about it, but it's still it still has the same result in terms of those who are taking care of her, and that is assuring her that it's okay. It's okay to be confused. Well, we all are, and we are. But no, it's just it's hard recognizing that we all are temporary here. Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe we should just avoid that subject altogether because, we have what Lawrence specified at the top there. And I needed to get all of Lawrence's clip in. I know that was a particularly long one, but I thought that it required a certain reverence because of the crisis of faith that we have in our SCOTUS. Now, I may not have shared the same, reverence to the Supreme Court. I suppose it was an institution that seemed, malleable, possibly. Even back in the Burger Court, I did experience a bit of astonishment when I realized the members of the court and how they got on the court and their evolution or growth or maturity while being members of the court, and how they couldn't be pegged. One might say, well, that was a very conservative justice appointed and or nominated and then appointed by a conservative president and conservative legislator, etc. And they changed over time and became liberal. And I always thought, did they? Did they really? Or is it like the rest of us? Or I don't know, maybe parts are getting a little bit more conservative or whatever. I don't know. It seemed that the conservative movement kept going further and further to the right, and the left just kind of stayed right there, Because I'm still fighting with Birchers to this day about whether Eisenhower is a commie because he built the interstate highway system. Jesus. I gotta say, whenever I hear this argument from Birchers, and I know I mentioned this earlier in the week, but the argument still continues about constitutional republic versus a constitutional democracy. And sometimes the wishy-washy response is, they're both. Because, that's giving in to their argument that democratic democracy is a bad word and anything that's associated with that must be bad. Now, I'll tell you how bad it was for us. They made liberal into a pejorative for decades and decades and decades, that for a while we started calling ourselves progressives just so we, could get another sentence in before we got the liberal commie rejoinder. Well, I'm a progressive. And it stopped them for a little bit. Then they started thinking, you're a liberal commie. Now, it's gotten to the point where progressives are liberal commies. In the worst possible way. Now, I like calling myself a liberal throughout it all because I don't care if you think it's a pejorative. Not you. But I'm talking about the rhetorical you with us wearing a red hat that says, Make America Great Again. Yeah, right. Make America great again so they can be slave owners. Which just shows how lazy they are. They want to not have to pay to get the work done. Isn't that just about the statement of what they really are about? They want all the benefits, but they don't want to have to pay for it. Okay? And the richer you get, the more apparently you're supposed to not pay. I'm not going to pay my Google Cloud bill. All right. Thanks. And then millions upon millions upon millions of we serfs suffer. And we did. That's right. Rate limited. You can only read so much. Oh, thanks. Wow. All right. Well, we did go very, very long with Lawrence. So why don't we go ahead? And it looks like we're going very long with ourselves here, too, in the morning rant. But let us give you a rundown on what we have in store for you in the rest of the salon of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Ooh, almost had a little sneeze there. All right, starting off with the Bistro Cafe, a newly released government study found drinking water from nearly half of U.S. faucets contains potentially harmful chemicals, like the ones they call forever chemicals. How nice. I like to filter my water and give myself the psychological placebo effect. Dozens of Vermont school districts sued Monsanto over toxic PCB contamination. And a Florida city famous for its water worries that it might run out of it. Darn. After the break, we move to the chef's table, where a virulent right-wing nationalist has succeeded in removing the name of black U.S. civil rights activist Angela Davis from a Paris school. A black Paris school, by the way, because she knows better. And Germany's top court blocked a parliament vote on a contentious bill to replace heat sources in the nation's homes. All that and more on West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit. netrootsradio.com. To the right of the page is the chat room link, and the chat room is monitored by Kelly Lincoln. Thank you, Kelly. Across the page to the left from that chat room link, near the bottom of our homepage at netrootsradio.com, is the link to our Patreon page. And hey, become a recurring Patreon of Netroots Radio. It really does help. So please do, and I'll fill you in more about what you could do to help us tomorrow. All right? Because it's the same old spiel I've been saying for years. Anyway, if you would like to follow Netroots Radio on Twitter while it still exists, but certainly on Mastodon and Spoutable. I don't know about Threads. Maybe Tom will put the station on Threads anyway because we have an Instagram account already. But I don't know. Facebook? Gee, I thought we were trying to get rid of Facebook. Anyway, you can follow us on Mastodon and Spoutable and still Twitter at Netroots Radio. And Tom takes care of that, and we'll find out what we're doing with other social media platforms and where we'll go and where we'll stay. If you would like to follow me on Twitter, Mastodon, and Spoutable, you can do so at Justice Putnam. And of course, I post the show notes and links diary on Daily Coz, and that gets posted 10 minutes before showtime. And you can always find the show notes and links diaries by going to my social media feeds, because all the links are right there to get to that one link to get to all the rest of the links. The show notes and links diaries is where you go. All right, anyway, follow me on those social media platforms at Justice Putnam. You can follow the show on Twitter as it sinks deep into the sea at Cookbook West. And please do pick up podcasts by way of Spreaker, not Stitcher, but where? TuneIn, iHeart, YouTube, iTunes. and wherever podcasts can be found. Yes. All right. Stumbling on my words today, but that's how it is. Yeah, I just felt a little sorry for my mom because she was a little confused, and I had to reassure and give her a hug and say it's okay to be confused. Because is it? What other state are we except constant confusion? We think that we have certainty. We think. See? That's the key. Alrighty, this first offering here, I think, in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy is by John Flesher from the Associated Press. Drinking water from nearly half of U.S. faucets likely contains forever chemicals that may cause cancer and other health problems, according to a government study released yesterday, Wednesday. The synthetic compounds, known collectively as PFAS, are contaminating drinking water to varying extents in large cities and small towns and in private wells and public systems, the U.S. Geological Survey said. Well, you know, if Trump was in charge, he'd be sharpening all that BS out of there. Gotta get him back. I kid. Researchers described the study as the first nationwide effort to test for PFAS in tap water from private sources in addition to regulated ones. It builds on previous scientific findings that the chemicals are widespread, showing up in consumer products as diverse as non-stick pans, food packaging, and water-resistant clothing, and then making their way into our water supplies. Because the USGS is a scientific research agency, the report makes no policy recommendations, but the information can be used to evaluate risk of exposure and inform decisions about whether or not you want to treat your drinking water, get it tested, or get more information from your state about the situation locally, said lead author Kelly Smalling, a research hydrologist. The EPA in March proposed the first federal drinking water limits on 6 forms of PFAS, which remain in the body for years and do not degrade in the environment. A final decision is expected later this year, or more likely in 2024. But the government has not prohibited companies from using the chemicals or from dumping them into public wastewater systems, said Scott Faber, or is it Faber, a senior vice president of the Environmental Working Group, an advocacy organization. Studies of lab animals have found potential links between PFAS chemicals and some cancers, including kidney and testicular, plus issues such as high blood pressure and low birth weight. The samples were taken between 2016 and 2021 in a range of locations, mostly residences, but also a few schools and offices. They included protected lands such as national parks, residential and rural areas with no identified PFAS sources, and urban centers with industry or waste sites known to generate PFAS. Most taps were sampled just once. 3 were sampled multiple times over a 3-month period, with results changing little. Scientists tested for 32 PFAS compounds, most of the ones detectable through available methods. Thousands of others are believed to exist but cannot be spotted with current technology. Well, that's heartening. Positive samples contained as many as 9 varieties, although most were closer to 2. The median concentration was around 7 parts per trillion for all 32 PFAS types, although for PFOA and PFOS it was about 4 parts per trillion, the limit EPA has proposed for 2 of those compounds. The heaviest exposures were in cities and near potential sources of the compounds, particularly on the eastern seaboard, the Great Lakes, and the Great Plains urban centers, and Central and Southern California. Many of the tests, mostly in rural areas, found no PFAS. Now, based on the data, researchers estimated that at least one form of PFAS could be found in about 45% of tap water samples nationwide. Now, the study also underscores that private well users should have their water tested for PFAS and consider installing filters. Filters containing activated carbon or reverse osmosis membranes can remove the compounds. Ratke of the Associated Press brings us this next offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Metro Shrimp and Grits Thursdays. Dozens of Vermont school districts have sued chemical giant Monsanto over toxic contamination in education buildings from now banned industrial chemicals known as PCBs. Last year, Vermont became the first state in the country to require older schools to test their indoor air for PCBs, which were used in building materials and electrical equipment before 1980. More than 90 school districts filed the complaint on Friday in federal court. They're seeking to recover costs and damages because, under Vermont's law, schools with high enough contamination levels must reduce exposure. Removing the PCBs will be expensive, and certain districts may have to demolish entire buildings and replace them with new ones, which in total could cost them hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, the lawsuit says. The PCBs are present in the school buildings from caulking and glazing compounds, sealants, adhesives, and other construction materials. Monsanto said the case has no merit and that third-party companies, not Monsanto, produce the PCB-laden materials likely used in the schools. Really? Monsanto never manufactured, used, or disposed of PCBs in Vermont and has not manufactured these products for more than 45 years, the company said in a statement with that terrible accent that just seems to show up. Monsanto is now owned by Bayer, the pharmaceutical and biotechnology company, because they think they can get away with it. The company is also seeking an emergency hearing and the preservation of evidence. Monsanto wants the districts to let it participate in environmental testing and PCB source identification and to document and observe the remediation work. Now, of course, we know that PCBs were used in building materials and electrical equipment like transformers, capacitors, and fluorescent lightning ballasts. U.S. EPA banned manufacturing and certain uses of them in 1979 over concerns they could cause cancer and other illnesses. A 2019 Associated Press investigation found that millions of fluorescent light ballasts containing PCBs probably remain in schools and daycare centers across the U.S. for decades after the chemicals were banned. The chemicals can be released into the air, and students and staff can be exposed by breathing in dust or vapors containing them, getting dust on their hands and then consuming it while eating and drinking, and having skin contact with materials that contain the chemicals, according to the department. PCB contamination forced an entire Vermont high school to move into a closed department store in downtown Burlington, where students have taken classes since March of 2021, while the old school is being demolished. The store, connected to a now closed mall, underwent a $3.5 million retrofit supported by the state.
Lori Rosa of the Washington Post brings us this final offering here in the Bistro Cafe part of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. In this fast-growing Florida city, water seemingly abounds. It's in the Zephyr Hills plastic bottles filled from the community's sparkling springs and sold in supermarkets nationwide. It glistens from a lake surrounded by trees and park benches, and it flows from a clover-shaped fountain outside City Hall. But as the city of pure water experiences a population boom, officials here are warning that the vital resource is increasingly in short supply. The population of Zephyr Hills has skyrocketed over the past decade, and the surrounding Pasco County area outside Tampa is now one of Florida's most popular destinations for new arrivals. Faced with a spike in demand, officials recognize that even a city famed for its water cannot keep up. So in June, the Zephyr Hills City Council passed a one-year moratorium on approving new construction, hoping to flatten the city's water usage after it came dangerously close to hitting the maximum allowance this year. "We need to pump the brakes and get the developers to slow down," said Ken Burgess, a council member and building contractor. "Let us just take a breath." Oh, my God, the guy's woke. The decision has added fuel to a mounting challenge in the Sunshine State. Florida is the nation's fastest growing state, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, part of a larger shift that picked up steam during the pandemic and continues. The new Floridians include retirees, but also young families, tech workers, and others lured by jobs, warm weather, and low taxes. And what does it bring you? Buildings that fall down and water supplies that run out. What a grand place to go to. The rapid growth has become part of DeSantis' platform for the GOP presidential nomination, and he frequently boasts that 1,000 people move to Florida each day. But that boom has come at a cost. Raising real estate prices and putting ever more strain on the environment and essential services, including the provision of water. And they don't even talk about how the fact that you can't even get an insurance policy on your house in Florida. Florida is full of water, among other things. Many areas that flooded in last year's devastating hurricanes have yet to recover, but bringing it up from underground, treating it to make it drinkable, and piping it to homes and businesses without upsetting the state's complex natural water system has become increasingly difficult and expensive. For Zephyr Hills, growth brought a difficult choice: keep expanding at a rapid pace or risk exceeding water pumping limits that all cities must follow and end up with potentially damaging environmental impacts and a hefty fine. Other Florida cities are likely to face this decision as homes are built, businesses expanded, and condominium units filled. The state's Department of Environmental Protection concluded in its 2021 annual water supply report that, quote, Florida's current fresh water supply is projected to be unable to meet all the growing needs of Floridians in the future, end quote. All right, there's more to that article, so go to the show notes and links and finish up on it. It's quite illuminating. All right, let us now go to our break, and when we get back from that break, we will go through weather from around the world, and we will finish up with the stories that we have curated for you today. You are listening to West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, and we will be right back.
You are listening to netrootsradio.com.
Please hang up and try again.
From a point at sea to the circles of your mind, a new force is at work for planetary transformation. New radio for a new Earth.
I was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean when it happened. There was a sudden jolt and our submarine crashed on the seafloor. We were in total darkness.
That's Dr. Dejana Figueroa, a marine biologist and STEM teacher, talking about a deep sea dive she'll never forget.
It's funny, when I was a kid, I was afraid of the ocean. And there I was, 2 miles below the surface. But as a scientist, you prepare for that. Using our training and a little creativity, we fixed the sub and finished our experiments. The dive was just too important. Every dive gives us glimpses at things few people ever get to see. Glowing creatures, fiery undersea volcanoes. When we got back to the surface, I kissed the ground and called my mom, of course. But you know what? I wouldn't trade that dive for anything.
Dr. Figueroa uses her passion for STEM to discover new things and make the world a better place. She can STEM, so can you. Check out She Can STEM for more stories and inspiration. A message from the Ad Council.
This is the story of a very special woman. In a matter of seconds, she turned herself into a great mathematician or an entrepreneur. Her knowledge was limitless and still is. She could also make monsters disappear, especially those that lurked in the shadows under the bed. Once, this woman put back together a teenage girl's broken heart, which had been shattered in 1,000 pieces, just by giving her a bear hug. She masqueraded as a regular person at work, but as a superhero at home. Everyone knows her as Gabriella. I still call her Mom.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need to help, complete with tips and resources at aarp.org/caregiving. A public service announcement brought to you by AARP and the Ad Council.
Hi, it's Tom. Could we humbly suggest your donation to netrootsradio.com? All we've got to run this 24-hour powerhouse of progressive resistance radio is what comes out of our own wallets. And you are our biggest donor. It doesn't take much, $3, $5. Just go to the bottom of our netrootsradio.com page and hit our secure donate button. Heck, you can even make a recurring contribution. So donate what you'd like at the bottom of our netrootsradio.com's homepage. Because you are our biggest donor. netrootsradio.com. Together, we are Resistance Radio.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1911. That was the day that the song The Preacher and the Slave first appeared in the Little Red Songbook. The Little Red Songbook was a compilation of labor songs published by the Industrial Workers of the World Union. The booklet was pocket-sized, so labor activists could carry it with them wherever they would go. Music was an important part of the IWW labor culture. Joe Hill was probably the most well-known of the IWW IWW songwriters. Many of the songs penned during this era are still sung at labor rallies and meetings today. But not everyone appreciated the music and the message of the IWW, a radical union that called for all workers to unite together. When IWW activists, or wobblies as they were called, would give speeches, they would sometimes be heckled and jeered. Authorities would harass and break up meetings. Sometimes Salvation Army brass bands that were competing for space and audiences on street corners would disrupt IWW rallies with their music. Joe Hill wrote his song, The Preacher and the Slave, in response to this musical disruption. He set the lyrics to the tune of the hymn In the Sweet By and By. Often, IWW songwriters satirized hymns played by the Salvation Army, which the Wobblies dubbed the Starvation Army. The lyrics tell of long-haired preachers who tell workers to stop agitating because they will eat by and by. The song was a critique of religious leaders who did not help working people. It became one of the most popular Joe Hill tunes.
Long-haired preachers come out every night. They try to tell you what's wrong and what's right.
Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com.
Thank you for accompanying us here to the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Metro Shrimp and Grits Thursdays. A little bit of jambalaya, a little bit of spice in your life. We always begin weather from around the world along the banks of the Rogue River in the Rogue River Valley of Southern Oregon on the west coast of the continental United States of America, where it is currently 65 degrees Fahrenheit, expecting highs in the mid-90s, plentiful sunshine with winds out of the west-northwest at 5 to 10 miles per hour. Clear skies tonight with lows in the mid to upper 50s, winds out of the west-northwest at 5 to 10 miles, and mainly sunny tomorrow with highs in the low to mid-90s, winds out of the west-northwest at 5 to 10. Grass pollen remains high in our little village of Rogue River. The air quality index is still in the good range, inched up a little bit to 40 parts per million, and that daytime UV index remains very high at level 9. Barometric pressure is falling at 29.93 inches. Visibility is up to 10 miles, and relative humidity is at 58%. Weather from around the world is brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world. London is 70 degrees and mostly cloudy. Paris is 80 and sunny. Rome is 90 degrees and sunny. Kyiv is 85 degrees and mostly cloudy. Kabul is 72 and partly cloudy. Hong Kong is 85 and fair. Tokyo is 78 and fair. Sydney, Australia is 46 degrees and clear. San Francisco, California is 56 degrees and cloudy with a wind advisory on the bay. And New York is 85 degrees Fahrenheit and sunny. And that is weather from around the world, brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world. Staff at the Agence France Presse brings us this first amuse-bouche
here at the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Authorities in the French capital region struck the name of U.S. black rights activist Angela Davis from a high school, judging her views on race relations to be too radical. The ultra-conservative head of the Paris region, Valérie Pécresse, has accused the university professor and former Black Panther of having views that feed communitarian feeling and can encourage violence. Speaking to a committee in March, the right-winger also criticized Davis's belief in the idea of systemic racism, which she denied existed in France, and said a certain number of recent declarations of France pose a problem. She pointed in particular to a joint letter signed by Davis and other academics in 2021, which accused the French state of having a colonial mentality, which was manifest in France's structures of governance, especially with regard to both citizens and immigrants of color. On Wednesday yesterday, after months of disagreement with local teachers and the national education minister, Pécresse's administration in the Île-de-France region renamed the suburban school after Rosa Parks, a U.S. civil rights heroine. It opted for Parks in the absence of any new proposition from the school's administration, according to an amendment adopted by the right-wing majority of the region's permanent commission. The 1,200-pupil facility was opened in 2017 in the Saint-Denis area of northeast Paris, which is home to a large black community, and was named Angela Davis by the school and the mayor. The move to strike off the name comes amid fresh soul-searching over racism in France after the police killing of a teenager of Algerian origin sparked violent riots and accusations of racism by the security forces.
Je te donne ce mon amour pour la vie entière, la promesse de me trouver à tes genoux. Aussitôt que tu m'appelles, rester toujours fidèle, c'est tout, c'est tout. Je te donne tous mes printemps, mes étés de mer, mes automnes quand les feuilles tombent partout. Si ce n'est pas une bonne affaire, je te donne tous mes hivers.
Staff at the Associated Press brings us this final amuse-bouche here at the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Germany's highest court yesterday, Wednesday, blocked government plans to hold a vote in Parliament this week on a contentious plan to encourage homeowners to replace fossil fuel heating systems with cleaner alternatives. The Federal Constitutional Court's ruling denies Chancellor Olaf Scholz's three-party coalition the chance to move on quickly from a dispute over a key climate policy plan that has dragged it down in polls in recent months. The government had hoped to get the legislation through Parliament tomorrow, Friday, the last day before its summer recess, but the court issued an injunction blocking Parliament from considering it this week, ruling in favor of a lawmaker from the main conservative opposition bloc who argued that his rights as a lawmaker would be violated by it being pushed through without any opportunity for a more detailed consideration. The two junior partners in the center-left Scholz's coalition, the environmentalist Greens and the pro-business Free Democrats, spent months arguing publicly about the legislation before emerging in mid-June with a bare-bones compromise over plans to replace old fossil fuel heating systems with alternatives such as heat pumps. It was firmed up into detailed legislation only last week, leaving opposition lawmakers angry
with the coalition's haste to get it passed before the summer break as it had originally planned. The heating issue is the biggest of several that have fueled an impression of constant squabbling and disarray in Schultz's coalition, which brings together parties that are not traditional allies. The squabbling in recent months has helped push down the coalition's poll ratings. The legislation calls for the installation of new heating systems that can be at least 65% powered by renewable energy. It would apply to new housing developments starting next year, but otherwise provides for potentially lengthy transition periods. Well, that brings us to the end of our broadcast period for the day, but you do know Netroots Radio broadcasts on, and we will meet up here tomorrow for Blue Moon Spirits Fridays. So do stay tuned to Netroots Radio all day and all night for all the breaking news as it breaks. And we will meet up here tomorrow, right here in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ma fleur sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, qu'il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte Goël. Je voudrais toujours te plaire dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je veux déjeuner par terre, comme au long de golfe clair, t'embrasser les yeux ouverts dans mon jardin d'hiver. Pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver.